Hi class. The mini lecture for today is taking a look at the marine ecosystem and the marine habitat. Just getting comfortable with a couple terms and again, working on reading graphs and different data sets from our textbook. But as we start, I did like this quote from our author of our textbook that the biologists have identified 250 marine species, and that number is constantly increasing as new organisms are discovered. Now, again, the majority of the new organisms that are being discovered quite deep, and again, our ocean is extremely deep. But let's take a look at our marine habitat. And how we're going to do that for the semester is we're going to look at the ecosystem or the ecological approach to understanding the organisms that live in the ocean and the relationship between those organisms that live in the ocean. Now, an evolutionary standpoint would look at the changes over time, but we're going to be taking a look at the organisms and how they interact with other organisms. Now, we can break that sort of into two different groups of information. The first being the abiotic factors. Whenever you put A in front of something, means the opposite. So it is basically not living portions of the ocean system. And then we've got the biotic, which would be the um, organisms and the relationships between the organisms. So over here, you have the abiotic factors or the physical factors, and it could be the temperature of the water. We've got some parts of our ocean that are extremely warm, and then other parts that are obviously extremely cold. We've got wave action. Some coastlines have really large waves that just pummel the coastline. Other locations, it's somewhat tranquil. Nutrient levels, we've got another mini lecture that will look at nutrients. And then what's on the bottom of the ocean or the substrate? Is it sand or is it rock or is it, different pebbles? Is it made out of tons of shells? So substrate is also a physical factor. And then on the biological side, just the organisms themselves, but some of the things that we're going to really sort of try to zoom in on would be the relationship between the predator and the prey. What are those organisms competing for? Are they competing for a mate? Are they competing for food? Are they competing for space? And then we've got a variety of organisms in the ocean that are working together. You know, maybe it's a tiny cleaner fish on a larger shark, or maybe it's an algae that's living inside of a coral. And so we'll look at symbiosis. And so this approach, again, is called the ecological approach, or just in general, we're going to call them ecosystems. As we describe the life in the ocean, we're going to break it down into three primary groups, maybe a fourth, which is sort of a combo group. But as you take a look at this diagram, again, the distribution of life is really primarily a function of sunlight and then organisms called producers that can grow and become the basic food for all the other organisms. And then, of course, we're in a gravity-based world. So when an organism dies in the ocean, they are going to sink. So you see the word here called detritus. And again, there are organisms of bacteria that are going to break down those nutrients. So you can see again, sunlight, organisms grow, organisms die, and then nutrients are added to the deeper water. Let me go back. Sorry. And so we've got these three categories of organisms. You've got the organisms that are just floating, called plankton. You've got organisms that are swimming wherever they want to, called nekton. And then you've got organisms that live on the bottom, called the benthic or the benthos. Now, again, if you've got swimming organisms on the bottom, like a skate or a ray, you can put them into their own category called nectobenthos. Let's take a look at a couple pictures describing these categories. The first one is plankton. So plankton is derived from the Greek, and it is just a term that means drifting. So organisms that drift, they go where the currents take them, are considered plankton. Plankton sort of fall into three categories. You've got plankton that does photosynthesis, phytoplankton, which you can see the cursor right here. And then you have plankton that are more like zoology. They eat, So zooplankton, which eat phytoplankton. And then you have a variety of organisms that are babies. And so they're crustaceans or they're worms or the larvae of fish. And then they ultimately will grow up into something much larger in the ocean. So that's just a brief overview of plankton, and you can see some of the pictures on the right. Plankton, the phytoplankton, well, again, it could follow in suit. You could have a zooplankton bloom after a plankton bloom, but you have a tremendous amount of growth. You need nutrients, you need sunlight, and then you can have these enormous sections of the ocean that have just a tremendous amount of plankton. The second group is called nekton, and again, you've got tuna and dolphins and whales. Any organism that is going to be going from one place in the ocean to another location is given this particular term. And so as we go through our semester, we're going to look at ecosystems that have large nekton and how much food is necessary ultimately to keep these very large organisms alive. And again, in comparison to the size of a human, you can see the blue whale. It's really somewhat astounding. Our third category, again, is benthos. And in dealing with benthic organisms, we're going to, again, introduce two terms. You've got organisms like coral on the right, which is attached. We'll call that sessile. And then we've got organisms that ultimately move. You can see the purple urchins, or vagile. And again, they don't move very fast, but they do have the ability to move along the ocean floor. So again, those are really our three categories: planktic organisms, nekton, larger swimming organism, and then you've got your bottom organisms. In dealing with the bottom organisms, I'm going to spend a little more time and give you two more definitions, but the vast majority of organisms in the ocean ultimately live on the ocean floor. Well, again, if you think about it, all of those falling dead organisms are food for a lot. And so you can have more organisms on the bottom of the ocean floor than you can, say, in the middle column of water. Our two terms are organisms that live on top of that benthic region. And again, the material that they're sort of going over is called a substrate. And you could have sand or you could have rock. And then because the vast majority of the ocean floor is made out of some type of a broken sediment, not just rock, you can have organisms that live inside of that. And so those organisms are called infaunal. So again, epi, like epidermis, like your skin, is a surface organism. Inside, or infaunal, are your clams and your scallops and your worms that are digging into the substrate. And then surprising, 98% of known marine species live on or in the seafloor. Here's an interesting graph. Now you take a look, you've got all these world species. You know, we're trending up towards 2 million world species. You've got the vast majority of those species are land species, which is interesting, right? A little bit. I mean, if you think about it, you would think that the marine would have more species because more of the planet is in water or covered by water. Then you also look of that, benthic versus open ocean or pelagic, again, is such a big difference between the two. So we want to know a little bit, why are there way more land species in comparison to marine species, and then why are there so many more benthic organisms than open ocean organisms? And again, this is an introduction, so we're just asking the question and we'll take a look at it throughout the semester. I will give one of the answers away: diversity. As we think about how organisms have different traits, you're going to have differences in the extremes. So because the land has such a much larger amount of cold temperatures to warm temperatures, you're going to have micro ecosystems or smaller scale ecosystems in different environments, which lead to species change, which leads to more diversity. Whereas you look at the ocean, it has a much smaller range of temperatures and a much more uniform sort of place to live. So the organisms over time haven't needed to change. So that's one reason why coastal and open ocean organisms have less diversity in comparison to land organisms. And that's it for today. I hope you guys have a great afternoon or day.